Awesome. Well, thank you, Ahmed, for that intro, and also just for being the one-man show who's organizing and making this whole thing function smoothly. As Ahmed said, my name is David Kay. I am with Memphis Meats. We are a cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood company based in Berkeley, California. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention we are hiring, so feel free to check out our website. But that shameless plug aside, I'm actually going to be speaking not about Memphis Meats today as much as about a different organization, the Alliance for Meat, Poultry, and Seafood Innovation, or AMPS Innovation for short. And so this is a group that you can think of as kind of a precursor to a trade association for the US cell-based meat industry. There are 7 members, all US-based cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood companies. And I'm going to talk in a moment about the work that AMPS Innovation is doing. But before that, I want to just rewind the clock a little bit and talk a little bit more about the context that led to the founding of AMPS Innovation. So let's go back about 5 years. And I think there was, and even beyond 5 years, I think there was a increasing recognition around the globe that the food system faced enormous challenges. Demand for meat is expected to roughly double by 2050. In fact, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue has said that in the next 50 years, we will have to produce as much food as we have in the entire course of human civilization, which is an incredibly heavy load to lift. And so into that challenge stepped a bunch of scientists and entrepreneurs. Memphis Meats was the first company founded in late 2015. And following that, a bunch of companies really started proliferating all around the globe. And many of these companies are at this conference today. But I've chosen just some of the really appetizing looking photos that are out there of cell-based meat products that these companies have demoed. And I think these entrepreneurs and scientists who started these companies recognized that one of the potential solutions to enabling our food system to meet this skyrocketing demand was to grow meat from cells and produce meat in a more resource efficient way. At the same time, we started to see a lot of interest from the general public. We saw press starting with the Memphis Meats media debut in early 2016 of our cell-based meatball. And once that happened, there was just a slew of media interest that really took off and has, for the most part, continued unabated since then. So these are just some of my favorite headlines from those early days. But I think, everybody here probably knows, they've seen this industry or the companies in this industry talked about in basically every media outlet that's at all related. So I think, that was an important way to demonstrate interest from the general public. Among all of these stakeholders starting to become interest, we also saw interest from stakeholders in the food and agriculture space. And so this really kicked off on the policy realm of the US in early 2018 when the US Cattlemen's Association sent a petition to the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, that was basically establishing their preference when it came to the labeling of cell-based meat and poultry. And so this was one of the first big public actions on the topic from a major stakeholder in the food and agriculture space. And so I think it deserves just noting. I talk about just the USDA, but there was a lot of attention paid by a variety of stakeholders in the meat industry, but also in the broader food and agriculture space. And of course, in response to all this interest, and in some cases even before the interest had really peaked, we saw governments around the world start to express their own interest in cell-based meat. So a handful of governments have actually allocated public funds for cell-based meat research and development. Countries like India, Israel, Singapore, the Netherlands, Japan. I'm sure many are aware Singapore recently approved the sale of cell-based poultry products. So that was an exciting first step. And I think, this was another kind of proof point for interest around the world for cell-based meat. In the US, the government was also very focused on cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood. And this looked more specifically like starting to clarify the regulatory path to market for the companies that were seeking to produce and sell these products. And so pictured here is the former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, Scott Gottlieb on the left. And on the right, the outgoing USDA secretary, USDA is the US Department of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue. And in March of 2019, they came together and their agencies came together and established in broad strokes what the regulatory framework will look like for cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood. And if you rewind the clock to that time, there was a lot of uncertainty over which agency would have jurisdiction over these products. And the answer, for the most part, is both. Both agencies, both the FDA and the USDA. So in broad strokes, the FDA will take a pre-market safety assessment, which is a common thing for food products in the US, as well as cell collection and growth and differentiation. And at the point of harvest, that jurisdiction will transfer to the USDA, which will handle any processing that needs to happen and labeling and things like that. The one big caveat here is for seafood. Seafood, for the most part, will be regulated entirely by the FDA, although the agencies have indicated that they're going to be working very closely together so that seafood, cell-based seafood and cell-based meat and poultry meet similar, face a similar regulatory paradigm. And I should say, I was asked in a panel I was on earlier this morning, why is it the case that cell-based seafood is regulated solely by FDA? And the reason is because that's how it is for conventionally produced seafood. So conventionally produced seafood is regulated entirely by the FDA. There are some exceptions like catfish, but for the most part, that is the case. Conventionally produced meat and poultry is regulated by USDA. And so in the interest of having a consistent and a fair playing field between cell-based and the conventionally produced counterparts, I think it made sense to maintain that jurisdictional divide for cell-based meat products. So to quickly recap, we've talked about entrepreneurs and scientists getting involved in starting companies. We've talked about the general public getting interest. We've talked about stakeholders in the food and ag space, and we've talked about governments around the world. And at this point in 2019, the cell-based meat industry started to realize that there was one important perspective that was not being represented in these conversations. The public conversation was happening, before companies were even selling products. And yet there was nobody who could speak as a collective on behalf of the industry. And that is really one of the core founding motivations behind AMPS Innovation. We wanted to provide an organization that could credibly be the voice of the industry. And so with that, AMPS Innovation was formed. And initially it was, we had 5 founding members. We have since in 2020 added 2 additional members, so we now have 7. And again, the goal of this group is really to represent the US cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood industry. And so what does that look like in practice? Well, we've been focused on a few different areas, and I want to tick through some of those now. A big part of our focus has been education. We actually traveled to Washington, D.C. about a year ago to inform and educate and open some channels of communications with important policy stakeholders in the food and ag space, including in the legislative branch as well as the executive branch. And of course, we haven't been able to do that this year. We had a meeting, a day of meetings on the books that got canceled because of the pandemic. I never thought that I would feel nostalgic for a 6-hour plane ride to Washington, D.C., but that's where we are in 2020. But we have been able to keep these meetings up in a virtual capacity. So we've been able to continue that education process and continue opening those lines of communications. Now, when I say policy stakeholders, I don't just mean policymakers, I also mean policy journalists. AMPS Innovation has had coverage in a lot of really media outlets that are really focused on US regulatory and policy issues. And some outside the US, like Financial Times, that are focused on a more global perspective. So that's been an important part, really making sure we are communicating not just with policy stakeholders, but like all the companies, with the general public as well. We even published an op-ed. This was published in Food Dive earlier this year, a bit before the pandemic really hit the US. And the argument here was an observation that the US has historically played a leading role in the food and agriculture space around the world. And if we want to continue to play that role in the future, it will be really important for us to make sure that we are supporting innovative new ideas like cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood. And I think, to the credit of both FDA and USDA, our feeling is that they have done a really good job of moving quickly on this, of being open to innovation, being open to the sustainability potential that these products could offer. And I think that they have done a really good job. The point of the op-ed was really to say that it's important to make sure we maintain that sense of urgency, because these are really important questions for the globe. And if we want the US to maintain a leadership position, it will be important to continue to push forward on those innovative ideas. We've also created a number of resources. These are all available on our website, ampsinnovation.org. These include fact sheets about the global industry. They include the US industry's official position on nomenclature. They include other information, news, media, press kits, things like that. So definitely encourage folks who are interested in cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood from a policy perspective to check out that website. This was really meant to provide some resources to people who may be curious and want to learn more. And one of the most recent things that we've done, which actually just happened a couple months ago, was we released a letter to the USDA. And the letter was doing a few things. One, it was encouraging the USDA to announce what's known as an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, an ANPR, to basically ask the industry to request additional information on product attributes prior to the expected rulemaking period that USDA will be doing. So this is a very kind of technical, weedy, bureaucratic issue here, and I don't think we need to dive too deep into it. The other thing that I think may be more accessible in this letter is AMPS Innovation came out in favor of a mandatory label for meat and poultry products. And I should say, within just shortly after sending this letter, the USDA announced that they do intend to have this ANPRM issued for cell-based meat and poultry. But I actually want to focus less on the content of the letter for the purposes of this presentation and more on the signatories, because as you'll see, AMPS Innovation was not the only group that signed this letter. It was also signed by the North American Meat Institute. And the Meat Institute is the largest trade association in the world representing the conventionally produced meat industry, certainly in the US. And I think this really speaks to the philosophy that AMPS Innovation has had. A lot of people ask me, is the goal of AMPS Innovation to counter the existing trade associations that exist for the conventionally produced meat industry in Washington, DC? And the answer is actually the opposite. We hope, wherever possible, to find partnerships with these groups. We think that there is a lot of common ground. We think that these groups share our mission of feeding an increasingly hungry planet. And so any opportunities there are to find common ground and partner with these groups are opportunities that AMPS Innovation is going to be very interested in. So I think, hopefully this is just the first of many of these sorts of partnerships with existing players in the food and agriculture space. And I think that is really a path that the industry has embraced, and it's also a path that that AMPS Innovation has embraced. The other question I often get about AMPS Innovation, and honestly, it's more of an observation than it is a question, is just an acknowledgement that it is incredibly early in the life cycle of this company, of this industry, to be organizing politically in this manner. It is not normal for companies that are not even, for industries that are not even selling products to organize in this way. And the reason that I bring this up is because I really think it speaks to another core philosophy of AMPS Innovation, and that is a desire not to avoid regulation, which I think sometimes you'll find with other innovative tech industries, but really a desire to embrace innovation. You know, we embrace regulation. We see regulation as a crucial piece of the puzzle, particularly for food. For food, consumers really demand to know that their products are safe and that their labels are non-misleading. And we think it's really important as a member of the food industry to make sure that the same is true for cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood. And so I think us organizing so early really speaks to the fact that we really want to make sure regulation is a key part of our strategy, and we can work with regulators and provide them with the information they need to know to make the most informed decisions possible about the industry. So, you know, in summary, I think AMPS Innovation and the companies that make up AMPS Innovation share the mission of probably most of the folks at this conference. We want to figure out a way to enable the food system to feed an increasingly hungry planet. And we're very much looking forward to working with anybody who's open to it to achieve that better world. So thank you, and happy to take any questions if there are any.